Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I'm so excited today to be speaking with, I hate to say it because it might offend some people, but this is my all-time favorite New Yorker writer, David Grann. He has written some of my favorite all-time articles and some of my favorite books. So today it's just going to be an absolute treat. A few words before we get started. For those who don't know, Mighty Blaze is here every Tuesday at 2 with The Thoughtful Bro, talking about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. We're an all-volunteer initiative. We help writers reach readers virtually. We started in COVID, and now beyond COVID in an ever-increasingly virtual world, we're holding up with the mission. We are never asking for money on a Mighty Blaze. If you want to show the love or show support, there's a few things you can do. You can like us, you can follow us, you can subscribe, you can tell your friends about us. And another thing you can do is support the amazing authors who come on our shows. For example, if you wanted to spend a little money, you could open another browser tab and buy a book about terrifying tales of disaster that explore the human condition, written by one of our masters of nonfiction, someone at the very top of his game, books like The Wager by David Grann. We are going to put lots of links to buy that book in the chat, so please go ahead and do yourself a favor. Little intro to David before we get started. He is, as I said, a staff writer for The New Yorker and the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Killers of the Flower Moon and The Lost City of Z. The Lost City of Z was a film on Amazon. Killers of the Flower Moon is coming out in the fall, directed by Martin Scorsese and starring De Niro and DiCaprio. It sounds like it's going to be like one of those 10 Oscar nomination type films. David's latest book is called The Wager. It's a tale of shipwreck, survival, and savagery. The reviewer for the Wall Street Journal said, "It was a tour de force of narrative nonfiction and the most gripping true life sea yarn I've read in years." Matthew Teague, writing for The Guardian, said, "There's an expectation." I love this. This is like some great review moments here. Matthew Teague said, "There's an expectation in reviewing a book like The Wager to balance its strengths with some discussion of its flaws. But The Wager is one of the finest nonfiction books I've ever read." My goodness. And the LA Times said, quote, "The story of The Wager is, like many of its antecedents, from Homer's Odyssey to Mutiny on the Bounty, a testament to the depths of human depravity and the heights of human endurance. And you can't ask for better than that from a story." So, David, a comp to the Odyssey. It's always a good day when you get one of those. Welcome to the
Me and Homer. Bro. I'm ready to go.
Well, David, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro. So glad to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. So as I was saying to you in the green room, I hardly know where to begin with your work. I, back 20 years ago now, read a book about white supremacy in the prison system. I didn't know who you were at that point. That was the first article I've read of yours. And I remember literally where I was sitting when I was reading that article 20 years ago. And ever since then, I've read every article you've written. And it's such a treat to have you on. And I think part of the structure of the interview today is I do want to talk about The Wager at first, but then I just kind of want to branch out a little bit and talk about, your process and sort of almost like philosophically what is driving you when you seek and write the stories that you do. So, but first, let's start with The Wager. A lot of superlatives have been thrown around about this book, the best, the greatest, and so on. But I want to add my superlative about this book, with all its eating snails and seaweed and teeth and hair falling out and cockroaches and rats and lice and scurvy and typhus. I want to say this is the filthiest book I have ever read.
Yes, it does have just about every grotesqueria as possible. Yes. My wife, who was always my first reader, whenever she would read certain passages, can we just have a little less on the cannibalism?
The book is just, it's so horrific. And there was this pattern in the book that would be like, something would happen that is just like so vile or so awful about human nature, some murder, some disease, like another of the many scores of deaths, and something totally just outright disgusting. And then there'd be like a cliffhanger, like, and then things really got bad.
It is a stage of descent into different versions of hell. It's funny, they set sail on the expedition with all these, certain hopes and ambitions of kind of returning with wealth and glory, and then yes, everything immediately goes to hell. And it's funny, when I structured the book, it was kind of like 4-part descents. It was like, okay, we set off and we have typhus, and then we go around Cape Horn and we have like the worst storm, and then we have skirt. It was yeah. It's like every time you think it can't get worse, oh yeah, it could get worse. But I will say this: if you do read the book, as however you feel about your own life today, feel a little bit better when you're done. I felt enormously better afterward.
I love that you think there's only 4 descents. If you had asked me like the amount, I would have had 27 descents into hell. All right. Why don't you, though, before I go any further, I mean, I tried to capture the book at the beginning, but why don't you just tell us a little bit about, what is the story and how did it come to you and why did you decide to write it?
Sure. Well, it began, well, let's do it this way. It began in about 1742 when as all good stories do, and I had no intention of going back to the 1740s. I'll circle back to why I began this. But it was in 1742 when this tiny little boat washes ashore off the coast of Brazil. And on board are 30 men. Their bodies are almost wasted to the bone. And they announce that they are the survivors of His Majesty's ship, the Wager. And that they had been shipwrecked on a desolate island off the coast of Patagonia, and that after building this flimsy little craft, they had traversed some 3,000 miles, completing one of the longest castaway voyages ever recorded. And of course, they're celebrated for this incredible act of navigation and bravery and ingenuity that they survived at all. And then a few months later, another little boat washes ashore, but this time on the other side of South America. It's even smaller. It's just like a dugout. It's got a sail that's stitched together from blankets. And on board are 3 additional survivors whose condition is even worse. One is so delirious he cannot even recollect his own name. But after they recover, they tell a very different story, that those people who had gone to Brazil were not, in fact, heroes. They were mutineers. And it soon becomes clear that while stranded on this desolate island, they had slowly descended into this real-life Lord of the Flies. And there were warring factions and murder, as we talked about, and mutiny and a wee bit of cannibalism. And then back in England, and this is the part that is kind of an added twist, back in England, the principal leaders of each of these factions and their allies are summoned to face this court-martial. And Joan Didion famously said that we all tell ourselves stories in order to live. And yet in their case, it's quite literally true, because after everything they've been through, if they don't tell a convincing tale, they could be hanged. And so that's kind of the little teaser synopsis. The story I first came across when I was doing research on mutinies, and I found this 18th century journal, which is lying on these piles behind me, from a midshipman named John Byron, 16 years old when the voyage set sail. If the name is familiar, he would later go on to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, whose poetry was greatly influenced by this account I was now reading. And it was written in stilted prose, but it had these passages that were very arresting. And it was the first thing that really piqued my interest and got my hooks into it.
Wow. One thing about a book like this is there was a lot of material here. As you just mentioned, there was a book, that Byron's book was published. There were other accounts and books published. Some of these books were some of the best-selling books of even the century, I think, right?
Yeah,
the 18th
yeah.
century.
One of them was like the greatest, piece of travel for the 18th century.
And if you go on Wikipedia and look up The Wager, I mean, that Wikipedia page is like miles long. And so the question I have for you about it is, why did you sort of have an instinct that, like, in your hands, this would be a successful telling? And, for example, did you think, well, I'm not going to add a lot of new information, but I just know how to frame it in a way that it's not been framed before? Or is it that you actually did some additional reporting on it and so on?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It was a story that was very well known in its day. Mm-hmm. Because what had happened on that island was scandalous. and undercut the central claim of the British Empire that its civilization was somehow superior to others, because on that island there they had descended into brutes. They didn't behave like gentlemen. And the account influenced philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu. It influenced the scientists, or was read by the scientists, Charles Darwin. It influenced two of the great novelists of the sea, Herman Melville and Patrick O'Brian. But it had largely been forgotten in contemporary times. There are very few people I knew who knew of the story, outside of circle of kind of maritime aficionados and some British naval historians. And so there was something to be rescued there, and a modern way to tell the story. And I think what really drew me into it was I was going to these British archives and looking and kind of rummaging through these logbooks and diaries and correspondence that are from the 18th century. These somehow survived shipwreck, or some of them went around the world. They're water stained. They survived typhoons. You open them up and you get submerged in a cloud of dust, and you would read them, and you could really meticulously reconstruct what had happened. And so I thought there was actually a great deal of material to be plumbed in a narrative. And then at the same time, when I was looking at these materials, these older materials, I was coming home, and, in the archives, I'd be reading about a war over the truth. There was like this disinformation and misinformation. And then I would come home and I would be reading about quote unquote alternative facts and fake news. Back in the 18th century, there were allegations of fake journals in this case. And then, I would go back to the journals and the time period, and I'd be reading about a war over history and who would get to tell the story. And then I would come back home and we'd be having our own war over history about, what stories we should tell, what statues should be seen, how do we reckon with the sins of our past? And the same thing was happening there. And so I found in this strange late 18th century story, it really did feel like a parable for our own times. And so I thought there was a couple of things. I thought you could reconstruct this in a modern way, really plumbing the material as a vivid narrative, and a psychological case study. And then you could also tell it and structure it in a way that I thought got to something about the very nature of storytelling and the nature of truth. And so I think those were some of the things I hope to bring to the story. But just as a small example, when you do research, you're kind of doing research and you're like, suddenly you're like, they're suffering from scurvy. And you're like, and so you say, you have this vague notion of scurvy. And you're like, well, have you ever read like a forensic account of what scurvy actually is like and what it does? And so I had all these journals and diaries describing it. And I was like, all right, I'm going to write try to write what it is that scurvy does to your body and to the company of a ship blow by blow.
Those scurvy passages are just wild. I mean, what an absolutely horrific illness, and it is compounded. The feeling I have about its horror is somehow compounded by how easily it is cured. But they just didn't, like, all you had to do was like suck a wedge of lime every day and none of this would happen. But now their skin is black, their hair is falling out, their teeth are falling out, their bones are breaking spontaneously. What a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that was like the great tragedy, because, I'm reading the journals and the logbooks, and they describe how before the outbreak begins to consume them, they had stopped on a little place off the coast of Brazil, and they describe it being these bountiful gardens, and there had been limes. And all they needed to do was bring limes on the ships. And of course, when the British Navy later learns that vitamin C could cure scurvy, they put limes on the ships, so British even became known as limey. So the cure that was quite literally within the grasp. And of course, you always have these weird moments too. I always find history so interesting when you're writing about the past, because even though I never ever expected to write about a time period so far away, it was not something I was really looking for. But there are these just strange connections and resonances. And so, for example, when I was describing and writing about the scurvy passages, it was right when we were beginning our own COVID epidemic here in the United States. And I remember, the kind of being confounded by not knowing exactly what it was, or what were the right steps. So like, we had packages coming to the door. I'd be in this little office here working, and then there'd be like a package at the door, or maybe food would come, and I was like, well, can I pick it up? Do I have to leave it outside for 24 hours? And you realize and so suddenly, like, when they're on this ship in these close quarters, I had such empathy for them, because they have no idea. They don't even know what germs are. They don't understand the, vitamin deficiencies. And so they're in this deep paranoia, sniffing the air, wondering, is it in a touch? Is it in a smell? What could be causing the disease? And, you think like, oh, we've advanced so much and our times are so separate from this. And you're like, no, not really. I mean, as much as we've advanced, there's still so much we don't know. And certainly in those early moments, we didn't know. So I had a great deal of sympathy for these poor men and boys as they were, being subsumed and consumed by this.
Oh outbreak. Yeah, and just the way that like uncertainty just compounds all our troubles, right? And psychologically, and I mean, if you look back on COVID now, knowing what we knew, we'll have a vaccine in this amount of time, and these are the symptoms, and this is what an extreme case looks like, and this is what. And if you knew all that, we would have just sailed through it, right? But I mean, so much of the suffering of COVID was like, how bad is this going to get, and what?
Paranoia? How paranoia sets in, and one of the things that, I think is, and I think we'll probably touch a little bit about this as we talk about other stories, but also this story, for me, one of the most interesting elements of any story you work on is the fog of information, and the fog caused also by disinformation, and the paranoia that can set in, and how much of our world is perceived but also misperceived.
Mm-hmm. So, David, you have described yourself as this kind of Joan Didion-like figure, in the sense that you like to just sit in a corner of a room and just watch things and like let the story.
I'm very happy here.
Just sit on a couch and like let the story come to you. And yet I can't help but notice that you, in researching your books, always end up in some jungle or in the middle of some ocean, like about to die on some squid hunting quest. And I mean, so there is a little bit of a dissonance between like your self-described Joan Didion kind of armchair like style and the actuality of this quest. And I've also heard you say that you describe, writing, you like writing about questing people, and writing a story is a kind of quest. And I just feel like that inevitable quest that you go on is like so central to kind of who you are and how you do your work. And so that's a lead into a question about what was the research like for this book.
Yeah. So, it's funny. I always, like to think that I'm kind of professionally dispassionate, and that the kind of Ahab-like subjects that I often report on, with their, bent, dreams and illusions and delusions, and that gets inside them, and, often causes them to do these kind of mad things, and often even perish on these mad quests. It's something completely apart from me. But I do find that often I end up doing these things on these stories. And, I think I now have come to realize, while I try to separate myself completely from my subjects, that perhaps there is something a little bit more there. There is some more connection. I do think there is a kinship between the quest of reporting and research and the quest that many of the people that I write about are often on, whether they're detectives or adventurers or scientists or whatnot. And that sometimes consumes you and leads you to very unexpected places. For the wager, I began, in these places that are more suited for Joan Didion-like. Although I don't know if she was such an archive rat. I'll spend a lot of time in archives, at least for something like this, where obviously it's from so long ago, and you could see some of the books on the floor and the research. And again, there was this kind of surprising trove of primary materials. For me, one of the most important things, if you're going to tell a story, especially from the 18th century, is can you reconstruct it? Can you reconstruct it in such a way that it's vivid, that you can get as close to the consciousness as possible to these figures you're covering. And so are there the diaries? Are there the letters? And you have to kind of learn to read these documents. It took me about a year of working on the wager just to really have a facility in the language of maritime life and 18th century life, so I could correctly read the documents, and they were kind of, a little bit more second nature to me. Otherwise, I won't be able to describe them. And I always say documents can speak to you in unexpected ways. And just one example of that is I pulled the muster books from the British Archives. Muster books at first to me seemed like gibberish. British historians to me, muster books can be very informative. But when I first pulled the muster book, I was like, seemed kind of, all it was basically the list of the name of a seaman when he came on board a ship, the date, and the rank. But there were a few kind of coded symbols next to the names. And I kept noticing the letters DD, DD, DD. And eventually I learned that DD stood for discharged dead. And so that this was in effect these men's epitaph. And that these were, each name suddenly became a soul and a life, but that these documents that at first seemed to me very anodyne or uninteresting really held the clues. You could actually calculate the horrific toll that this expedition had taken. Nearly 2,000 men had set sail on the Wager and the other ships in the squadron, which were chasing this Spanish galleon filled with treasure before the Wager ultimately wrecked and became lost on this desolate island. And out of those nearly 2,000 men who went, more than 1,300 perished. So that's the kind of thing that documents can tell you when you don't expect. And I spent about 2 years just kind of mining these materials, thinking that's the way I would tell the story. But it was in about 2 years in when I began to be gnawed by those little doubts that began to eat at me. And you're just always wondering about what you don't know. You're kind of haunted by what you don't know. Even as the mounds of materials pile up, you're like, but wait. And I did always have that fear, that doubt, like, well, could I really understand what these castaways had experienced on that island unless I went there myself? Because that's when I decided to do my kind of rather foolish trip to Wager Island, which if you want, I'm happy to detail for you.
Foolish, but knowing you, inevitable trip to Wager Island.
It probably is. What's funny is I never think about it. And I honestly, it never, when I began my book, ever occurred to me that I would go to Wager Island. I mean, I say that completely seriously, but then the idea gets in there, and yes, it probably was inevitable. I'm basically, it's funny. Clearly, as a reporter, I can report on others, and I have no sense of reporting on myself.
That's what I'm here for. But all right, so I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but I have to ask, just give us in like one word or a phrase, when you got to Wager Island, truly one of the most desolate places on earth, and scene of one of the great horrific, shipwrecks and tragedies ever. When you finally set foot there, what struck you about it?
There were two things. One is, they had described finding virtually any food there, and I was struck by the fact that there was virtually no food to be found. And I was also struck by just the kind of cold it was, because I had looked it up. They were always saying in their journals they were freezing, but I looked it up. I was like, okay, it's about 30 degrees. It's not Antarctica. I've written about Antarctica before. I was like, it's 30 degrees. But when you get there, it's so windy and it's always wet. It's always raining or sleeting. And so clearly they all had hypothermia too. So it was just this cold, wet. There was my biggest takeaway, if I were to sum it up, was there was a British officer who described the island as a place where the soul of man dies in him. And as I stood there in the cold, wet, looking about me, I had brought a sandwich with me, so I wasn't starving, thinking about those poor men. So I didn't really want to experience exactly what they experienced, but thinking about what they had gone through, I could finally understand why that officer had said that. I was like, yeah, my soul would have died here in me if I had to stay here. And then I guess the only other revelation, or one other very striking revelation, was at one point the group, a member of my group pointed to a pool of water, a stream, and floating just underneath the surface were these timbers. And these were from an 18th century ship that are believed to be from His Majesty's ship, the Wager. They had been discovered about a decade earlier by the Scientific Exploration Society that had done a joint expedition, British and Chilean. And so that's what we knew what they were. But that was all that remained of that ferocious struggle that once took place there. So that also just struck me because, you know, you're spending years documenting the sound and fury, this furious struggle that took place there. And that's it. That's all that remained of all those ravaging dreams of empire.
That and a really good story. One pair of questions before we move on from the Wager. You know, what strikes me about the way that you talk about your work is the kind of despair that you personally feel about almost everything you write. And you don't know if you have it. You don't know if it's going to work. It's not what you think. You know, it's not what you initially thought it would be when you set out. And I'm just wondering, for this project specifically, was there a moment where you thought, I just don't have it? And what was that moment? And then also, what was a moment where you were truly excited and you thought, this is going to work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, you're always plagued by doubts at certain points because it's such a long odyssey. You know, you're on this, and you know, it's hard to pick one for one because things resurface or kind of breakthroughs and then stumbling blocks on like what'll become a 5-year odyssey. And you know, I think early on, just the challenge of learning the world of a ship and my terror of knowing, like, how do I bring the 18th century world of a ship, you know, to a modern reader, to myself? You know, for me, the fundamental similarity and the reason I'm drawn to a story, it doesn't matter whether it's in the past or the present, is that human nature is fairly unchanged, you know, over time. You know, the speech patterns change, the costumes change, but humans are still humans doing remarkably brave things and then doing just remarkably shocking, awful things to each other. And so that's the commonality. But, you know, how do you just still penetrate and crack open that world? And I was telling this story from the point of view of these 3 particular figures who were on the Wager, the captain and the gunner and John Byron, the midshipman. I was like, how am I going to understand what their world is like? So I think that was kind of the initial kind of most daunting terror. And then I think at a certain point, you know, you just read something or something they say, and you don't need to decode it, and it just kind of makes sense. Or you come across some phrase about the ship, and it makes sense. I mean, there also came a part where my learning curve just felt reached, where like I could tell you. I mean, it's now, you know, like a sinking ship with a hole; it's leaking out gradually. But I could tell you everything about a ship and where you stood, every little weird nautical phrase. And I think there was a certain point when I had them around Cape Horn, and by that point I had learned so much about the ships. And so when I'm reading the journals and they're describing the topmen scurrying up the mast, they use their bodies as sails, like I got it. Like I knew exactly what they had to do, where they were climbing. And there was no longer, oh wait, I got to go consult the book and how did they climb the mast? Like I just knew it. I had enough knowledge, and I had enough so I could just grasp it. And I could envision and see based on what they were describing. I now had these mental pictures that were so vivid. And so I think that's kind of where you suddenly feel you have it. And so I think rather than there being like one breakthrough or one stumbling block, it's more like this. It's like this. And you still, you know, and then you get to the end and you just can't believe it. And then you say, I'll never go again. And now I'm looking for my next idea to go again.
And just one further question on the despair. I had Eric Larson on the show, and he's terrific. Yeah, he's terrific. And I asked him if he had any abandoned projects, and he described one of them to me. And I said, well, what was the thing? What was the deciding factor that made you abandon that project? And he said, it just lacked heart. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have any abandoned projects? And like, if you could kind of boil it down, what would be the reason that you abandoned that?
I really like that he said that, because I you know, I wonder if he was referring to the story itself as having the heart or his own emotional connection to the material. I'd love to hear, you know, and I'd love to grill him on that, because it's very interesting to me. The more I do these stories, the more I actually do think, I have never used that phrase. I think I may steal it, but like, heart is really important. And by heart, it doesn't mean it's like always a happy or negative story, but that there is an emotional currency that runs through a story. That, we are collectors of facts. We are just vacuum cleaners of factoids. But within those facts are flesh and blood and human consciousness and souls and lives lived and lost. And so for me, increasingly, I've come to recognize, at least even in what I like to read, that it has heart, that it has some emotional currency that draws you out, that it's not, just a Wikipedia entry. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that you said. I never quite used that phrase. I mean, for me, I will come across stories, and I'll speak a little bit vaguely rather than name something specific, but, often it's because, there's, like, for example, I have spent now a month, several weeks researching a story, which I won't name because I'm still toying with it, but, it's a really interesting story. It's a historical story, but not that old. It does actually have emotional resonance, but I can't yet quite find the material and the people and the thread line to tell it so that there can be that heart, that it won't just be these kind of dramatic events told from a distance, that somehow I can get inside the story. So I haven't found my way inside it. So I feel like it has the themes, it has the dramatic points, and I think it's an importance, but I can't yet crack it. I can't find my way in. Part of that is connected to the materials that exist, and who to kind of follow in the story as a result. So sometimes it's just a kind of that challenge. I mean, sometimes it's very simple. There's a spy story or some story I really want to tell, and the records turn out to be all classified. So sometimes you just shut down. Sometimes you can't get people to speak. So it's all different reasons. But I also think stories especially for book length projects, they really do have to be rich, and they really have to have lots of dimensions. They can't just be one-dimensional stories, which for a magazine story they really can be, and they can be terrific. But if you're going to do a book and it's going to be unfolding, it's going to have many little places you're going to go down.
Right. All right. So let's jump from there into some of the bigger things that unite your work. I'm not the first to observe that there are like some elements that are common in many of your stories. There is this kind of a monomaniacal kind of figure who like has a Captain Ahab like obsession with something, a clearly irrational obsession, which forces them often into some disaster, some extreme location where they are in absolute crisis, just kind of on every level. And I mean, I guess like if I put it in a phrase, I would say crisis reveals, right? Like that is like sort of a classic hallmark of some of these David Grann stories. And I'm just guessing, like, I'm sorry, I just want to ask, like, do you see that crisis reveals thing? Is that like something that you're consciously looking for? I mean, for example, The Wager doesn't quite have that Ahab-like figure. It certainly has in spades the crisis reveals aspect of it. But I'm just wondering if you can even consciously articulate, like, I know what I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. No, like, no, I mean, in the sense that, like, I don't think of it, like, I don't, it's interesting that I've done more stories and people will point things out. I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. I guess I do find this, as opposed to being like, okay, I kind of did this story. Oh, this story has those elements. Because I'm always trying to kind of move away from whatever I did last subject wise. Like I'm such a generalist that, like, but there are, I wouldn't disagree that there are these connecting themes that I now can recognize, or people will point out often with them. I suppose, because I think a lot of what draws me to stories, even though I go through this kind of very rational analytical process, is kind of irrational. It's just kind of like, that's really interesting. Like and I have all these questions, just becomes really curious. But I do think I'm looking for something in general that reveals something. I want a story that is illuminating something about this, what I consider completely mystifying, which is human existence. I still find human existence completely kind of astonishing and bewildering, and so I spend my life looking for stories or reading stories by others. You know, we talked about Joan Didion, whatever it might be, that, you know, they just are casting some light and like, oh, okay, I kind of have a better understanding of the human character or where we do things in certain situations. I do think that, so I'm drawn to that. And then, and quests tend to bring that out, and circumstances bring that out. And so, if you're just kind of sitting on a Caribbean island, drinking some, cocktail, I mean, maybe you have some despair or crisis, maybe, but it may not draw out all that. And so there's something, for example, whether it be The Wager, or other stories of Lost City Z, or The White Darkness, where a guy who's obsessed with Shackleton walks out. They're put in these extreme circumstances where they often confront obstacles that are almost insurmountable. So humans suddenly confronting that ultimate obstacle, and often have to confront their own mortality, which is really the great riddle of all, right? That's what we're all trying to make sense of. And how they handle that, how they navigate that, I think could be extremely revealing. And so if life is a laboratory that kind of tests us, but there are certain particular circumstances where everything is at a boil, and it's in those kind of tight, confined quarters where we often learn more how humans treat each other, how they see themselves, and how they behave.
Yeah, there just seems to be this kind of ichi homo, kind of behold the man at the center of all your work. Just like, here is the thing itself. Here is human nature. And a phrase that is often used about your work is the human condition. Like, this shows the human condition. It's a vehicle to talk about the human condition. And let me just ask you point blank, David, what is the human condition?
I mean, that's what it is. I mean, sorry, I don't know. I should not be swearing live.
It's okay.
It's good. I think there was a little back static there, which I really hope to just kind of, no, to me, it's like, it's wondrous and maddening. And it's, it's essentially this. It's that basically we're put on this earth. We have a limited amount of time. We don't know what we're going to do with that time, but we all know it's going to end. And the great democratizer is it's all going to end the same. Doesn't matter where you come from, where you are on the globe. If you have money, you have no money. It's all going to end. It's going to all end the same. And so what you do with that time, to me, is the human condition. And trying to make sense of it, and do you make it meaningful or don't you make it meaningful? Do you try to help others? So you're always just trying to answer that simple question of, we're kind of thrown on this earth. We have a limited allotment of time. And what are we going to do? Some people choose to do good and some people choose to do bad. And often it's a mixed bag. And to me, it's just that kind of riddle. And so I think a lot of my stories are mysteries. I think that also kind of unites them in the sense that they're about kind of trying to perceive situations reportorially or historically, or make sense of events. It's also about people trying to make sense of themselves. And I think life is kind of a mystery. Wow. I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, it did. Big time. All right. I want to highlight this from a slightly different angle too, because another thread that I see in your work that I haven't really seen talked about is the presence of indigenous people and a kind of confrontation between white culture and kind of European culture and indigenous culture. And for example, Lost City of Z, there's a lot of that in that story. In The Killers of the Flower Moon, obviously it's just an outrageous conflict, a hidden conflict, but all the more outrageous for that reason. And then of course, there's just this classic scene in The Wager, which is just almost like the chef's kiss, like platonic form of the ironic confrontation between white people and the natives, where the white people are sent with an order from the king to like save and rescue the savages, right? And then here they are, like a year later on an island, like their teeth and hair falling out, like killing each other and eating each other. And then the natives come along and like save them. Yeah. And it was just the perfect form of that kind of confrontation. But the thing I wanted to draw out from you is that it seems that maybe it's just a coincidence, David, because you're always writing about extreme environments and sort of people going to places that they don't quite belong or that nobody has ever been, at least from their culture. But is there something there about like the way you want to explore human nature that always ends up with this kind of meeting or conflict between white culture and indigenous culture?
Well, again, I won't say that I always consciously said, okay, let me find a story where that specifically happens. But I have
Right.
been drawn to these stories. And sometimes I don't even know, when I first looked into The Wager, I didn't know that was even there, that there was going to be this encounter where the natives show up and offer them a lifeline. And of course, the castaways, because of their imperial attitudes, mistreat some of the indigenous people, and it really raises the question. There's a question in Killers of the Flower Moon, after members of the Osage Nation, when they were in Kansas on the reservation, were massacred by white settlers, and a U.S. government official wrote in a report, if I remember it correctly, something to the effect that the question will arise, which of these people are the savages? And I think that's a central question that arises, obviously, in The Wager. So I do think when you that those encounters, when you write about history, especially American history, I think you can't avoid them because they were so fundamental. You're writing about archaeology and anthropology in the Lost City of Z, for example, and so much of the attitudes of the indigenous and of anthropology was kind of shaped by these racist imperial attitudes. And I also think, I'm struck by, misperceptions that often apply to these cases. And then also, we talked a little bit about the riddle of the human condition. And I think one of the things that is commonplace are these racist, corroding attitudes that is apparent in several of the stories I've worked on. And you could keep going, you could keep finding these kind of deep, sinister elements of racism that are destructive and are blinding. They're kind of blinding. And so it also gets to that fundamental and corroding. So, I didn't fully answer your question, is that it's not always conscious where I say, okay, I'm going to look for that. But it almost inevitably becomes part of the stories I work on, I think, because of the nature of the stories and because it was so commonplace when you're writing, certainly about American history.
Right. All right. One last question from me, and then we'll take a couple from the audience. You said something so beautiful once. I was listening to another podcast on Friday, and I was on a walk, and I literally stopped in my tracks when I heard you say this. This is a question about your writing process, and you were talking about how on a story called The Squid Hunter, where you were trying to, you went on this wild adventure with this obsessive, truly Ahab-like figure who's looking for this beast in the seas, and you almost got killed on this wild storm, and days and days you're looking for this squid, and ultimately you think you find it, but then you don't really find it. And you talked about how you learned how to be a great writer on that story, and that the phrase you said was, every story is a lost city of Z that you never find. And the idea being that you have a notion or a conception of the story of what that story would look like in its kind of ideal form. You're going to find the squid, write about that quest, great. And then it didn't turn out like that at all. And yet there was still something beautiful and haunting and true. And there was an incredible story in that non-story. And I just love that. I think it's applicable to every kind of writer, and this idea, this kind of chasm between the initial conception and the ultimate work, and how do you arrive at that ultimate work, which is so different from the conception.
Yeah, and that was a real learning experience, that story. You try to learn from each story, each adventure you go on, you try to hopefully you get a little bit better and a little bit wiser, because it is an experiential craft. I mean, it is something you actually learn by doing. And I remember, the Squid Hunter story. Yes, I had I was following this Ahab-like scientist who had this dream of capturing a baby giant squid and becoming the first to capture it and then grow it in captivity. And that was the way I pitched the story at the New Yorker. And that was kind of the fairy tale, I thought. And we went through this incredible odyssey. And I mean, that was a true tempest. I don't know what a typhoon or whatever you want to call it, had just kind of passed. The seas were so rough. And then at one point we thought we had capture the baby, and it was almost there. And then we had lost it to the point I didn't even know if it was fully there. And at first I thought, I had this deep sense of despair. Well, the scientists had this great sense of despair in that moment. And all I kept thinking in that moment is, I'm dead. I'm like, I was new to the New Yorker. I had pitched the story. I'd come all the way to New Zealand. I spent money on their budget. And I had, I had this story. Now it's gone. And like, what am I? And I couldn't even see that the story was staring at me, because I had kind of concocted this BS narrative in my head, this kind of fairy tale story. And the truth was obviously so much more meaningful and real, which was, here was a man who had devoted everything and sacrificed everything to capture species. And here he had almost had it, and then he had almost lost it. And it was just so much deeper and more profound and revelatory. And it really always taught me that you have to be open to the story, and you have to be careful about tunnel vision, which is something I read about investigators who have, and that reporters can have. And you have to be open to the truth, which can be more mysterious and surprising and startling often than fiction. And you just have to be open to it. But I couldn't even see it at first. I really couldn't. And that always stayed with me.
Yeah, it's almost like the actual, like the details of the story, the trappings of the story, the plot, the outward plot of the story is really, as we've sort of said in so many words on this interview, like a laboratory or just a setting for the true show, which is the revealing of the human nature beneath it all.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. All right. Let's take 2 quick questions for the audience if we have time. I think we do. So just throw them up on screen. Okay. From Peter Z. A group in dire straits like the Wager crew may devolve into inhumanity. There wasn't any evidence of that kind of thing on the Shackleton expedition. Why? Is it leadership, personalities, resources? What is it?
I think a huge part of it is leadership. And the captain of the Wager was a tempestuous figure who had certain real abilities, bravery. He was a skilled seaman, but fate can be cruel. And on that island, he finds himself in these very extreme circumstances, and he is missing some of those Shackletonian abilities. And what that really is, it's kind of hard to describe, but the Wager is kind of a study of different forms of leadership. And that Shackletonian ability was, this kind of ability to lead through inspiration, cajoling, leading by example. It's almost as deeply psychological. And that was missing from the captain on the Wager. Interestingly enough, though, on this expedition, for those who have read the book, or if you do read the book, there is a very Shackletonian figure who we haven't talked about. But the Commodore of the expedition, in many ways, does have some of those abilities. And, one of the things he does is he kind of elides the stifling nature of hierarchy at that time. And he works alongside the men, leading by example during various calamities, and has some of those kind of Shackletonian abilities that Ernest Shackleton had demonstrated.
Yeah, I love Shackleton myself. I mean, it's like sort of one of these great stories. I mean, it would have been a great David Grann story. It's sort of been, it's as you say, it's got its own subgenre of literature around it. I mean, so many people have written about Shackleton, but it stands out as a great David Grann story in the sense that it is a story about complete failure and disaster and privation, but it reveals something astoundingly beautiful about human nature in this one figure.
Yes, 100%. I always, when I was a reporter early in my career, and I was either covering politics or sports, if somebody said you can go cover the winning presidential election or the losing presidential election, I always wanted to choose the losing, because it's that losing election that somebody who has sacrificed, probably since they were in high school, burning with this ambition, certainly since college, and they've spent years and money and their whole life contorting themselves to fulfill this ambition, and then they get so close and they lose it. Well, that's going to tell you a lot more than the winning president. And similarly with the winning locker room versus the losing locker room. So it's often in those circumstances where we actually can learn something deeper and more profound.
So true. Let's do one more question. Did you ever dream about some of the horror? Did you ever dream about some of the horrors you describe in The Wager? I mean, I think the question is about actual dreams, like
Yeah.
nightmares.
I mean, it's a question. I don't always remember my dreams. When you're writing, when you are writing about this, I will say like bits about the scurvy just stay with you. There were times you just kind of shiver. And often when you're writing a section of a book, it's not like you sit down on the computer and that section is written. It could be months to write that chapter. And there were months before that, preceding that, researching it. So you're kind of living with this material for a long time. So I don't know if you remember your genes, but you definitely have these kind of shivers and shudders periodically. And you can't help, like when you go down to the fridge and you're like, oh, orange juice, be like, oh, I better have my juice.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, look, David, we're going to wrap here. I have one last question for you. This has been terrific. Thank you for all your candor on this. And I just love these kind of digging into the philosophy of some of these stories. But my question for you is this: as somebody who's always on the prowl for a great story, I wonder, is there some dream story that you could write? Let's imagine that like you could have the full access to the historical figures, the documentation. I mean, you could think of some scenario that they're like, there's no documentation about it, but somehow you would find like the lost book about this incident or something, right? Tell me about like an incident or a figure that you have like long wanted to write about, but would be a perfect book, but the info isn't quite there. The opportunity isn't quite right.
God, this involves a quick mind and my mind is slow. I'm going to give you a strange answer that it just because it's on my mind, and it's not perhaps the answer you would want. I mean, I'm trying to think if there's like something, sometimes it has to do more with stories that are done or being done. I think those are the ones that sometimes get me more. So like, even for example, I think what happened in this country with the insurrection and on the Capitol, is one of the most important pieces of history and one of the most important events. And so I look at it, I sit here and I keep looking at it and reading about it. And there's so many wonderful reporters covering it and books being done on it. So it would be a story I would long, if I could have all the material. If I had the terrain to myself and could just, spend my 5 to 10 years just writing, but it's not really possible. So I think it's something like that. When you look back and you read like John Hershey doing Hiroshima, you read there are these kind of seismic events that I think are so important. But I can't always find a way in. The other option would be to kind of just live a really long life. So if I could live another 50 years and then with the power of hindsight, tell this story, look back on it, find maybe new documents, new letters, new correspondence, but also just maybe be able to see it. You asked me that first question about The Wager. And I think one of the powers and one of the reasons that I draw into these older stories now is you could just turn your head a little bit and you get to just see them slightly differently. So that's not, I don't know if that really answers your question, because it's not like an unknown story. It's not a mystery. It's an unfolding story that's being so well covered. But it is the type of thing that I think is so important that in some world I wouldn't mind or wish I could tell it.
I love that answer. I mean, I'm like super psyched about that answer. That is like exactly what I was looking for. And I think that like, so a couple of reactions to that. Like, one is that I do think that story will be told. I mean, maybe we just need breathing room and we need all the documents to come in, and we need sort of, I mean, it sounds grim to say, but we sort of need like all the people to die in a way, because like then like everybody will finally come forth and be like, well, now that person's dead and I'll really tell you what he said to me. But I think like there is a seething, smoldering heart of this story, which boils down to like, what did Trump actually say to these people? I mean, if we could just, I feel like that story could be told if there was just a recording of everything Trump said in the 2 months leading up to that. We'd sort of know the answers, but it's like this sort of black hole that everything is revolving around, but nobody knows really what's in there. And I I agree. It is
Yeah.
just this great unanswered question in our culture right now.
Yeah. And I think the thing that we won't also be able to answer until time has passed is, was this a feverish moment in American history? Was it a breaking fever, or was it an all-consuming fever?
Mm.
And so I don't think we yet know how to adjudicate or fully assess the implications of what happened. We could try to prophesize and predict, but we don't yet really know what's going to happen to that fever.
Mm. And by the way, talk about a laboratory for human nature. I mean, just seeing like what happens to those people like Mark Meadows and others who are just very close to the center of that, and how people are warped and transformed and change at the heat of that moment, I think is just another great, it's a bunch of great character studies just waiting to be written. David, this has been so terrific. Like all of your articles, it surpassed even my very high expectations. So
my pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much.
This has been wonderful, folks. The link to buy the wager, again, which several reviewers said basically in the Wall Street Journal and I think the LA Times book review, like maybe the greatest work of nonfiction they have ever read. I mean, don't take it from me, take it from everybody else. This is a book that is worth your time, and it's just an incredible read. And David, it has been such an honor. It's so great to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, folks, we'll see you next week on The Thoughtful Bro. Take care and keep reading.